Good evening and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Suddhāso and we'll be looking at another discourse of the Buddha. So I'll start by paying homage to the Buddha, then I'll go through the discourse and give some explanations, and then I'll take any questions at the end, so please feel free to type in questions at any time. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang namang sanghang namassami. So the discourse for this session is from the Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 7, sutta number 67, Nagaropama Sutta, which is the simile of the citadel. So the discourse begins. Buddha said, "Monks, when a royal frontier citadel is well provided with 7 essentials and gets 4 kinds of sustenance when needed without trouble or difficulty, it is then called a royal frontier citadel that cannot be overrun by external foes and enemies." So this is the main metaphor that the Buddha is using here. So he's going to be talking about the 7 things which are supportive to a military encampment, a military fort, in order to be safe, in order to be strong. And then similarly, he'll be analogizing that to the training of the mind. So talking about how we fortify our mind in the same way that one would fortify a castle or a military encampment. And this is one of the things about the Buddha, is that the Buddha was in fact born into a family of aristocratic warriors. So the Buddha was very familiar with military strategy at the time and would have been trained in military strategy. So there's quite a number of discourses where the Buddha uses military terminology or military concepts in order to create metaphors to explain the training of the mind, to explain Buddhist practice through this kind of imagery and metaphor. So then the Buddha carries on with explaining the metaphor that he's using here. So he says, with what 7 essentials is a citadel well provided? Says, first, a citadel has pillars with deep foundations, firmly embedded, imperturbable, and unshakable. This is the first essential with which a royal frontier citadel is well provided, to defend those within and repel those outside. So the first one is to have pillars with deep foundations. So a very strong foundation to hold up the rest of the structure. Second one, he says, a citadel has a moat that is deep and wide. Third, a citadel has a patrol path that is high and wide. So this would be around the perimeter, so from which one can clearly see who's coming and going. Fourth, he says, a citadel has stores of many weapons, both projectile and handheld. Fifth, he says, many kinds of armed forces reside in a citadel, such as elephant riders, cavalry, charioteers, archers, bannermen, adjutants, food servers, warrior chiefs, princes, chargers, great warriors, heroes, shield bearers, and indentured warriors. And he says, sixth, a citadel has a gatekeeper who is wise, competent, and intelligent, who keeps strangers out and lets known people in. And seventh, he says, a citadel has a wall that's high and wide, covered with plaster. And he says, so these are the 7 essentials with which a royal frontier citadel is well provided to defend those within and repel those outside. And then the Buddha says, what are the 4 kinds of sustenance it gets when needed without trouble or difficulty? It says, first, a royal frontier citadel has much hay, wood, and water stored up for the enjoyment, relief, and comfort of those within. Second, it has much rice and barley stored up. Third, it has much food, such as sesame, green lentils, and black lentils stored up. And finally, it has much medicine, such as ghee, butter, oil, honey, molasses, and salt, stored up for the enjoyment, relief, and comfort of those within. Here we get the sense once again of the basic metaphor that he's using. So the 7 characteristics of a citadel, which make it hard to overrun, and also the 4 kinds of sustenance which are needed in order to keep the defenders of the citadel well nourished and healthy. So then the Buddha says, in the same way, when a disciple of the noble ones has 7 good qualities, and they get the 4 jhanas, the 4 stages of meditation, he says, blissful states of mind in the present life that belong to the higher mind, when they want, without trouble or difficulty. Then they are called a disciple of the noble ones who cannot be overrun by Mara, the wicked one. At this point, the Buddha will explain the relevance of the metaphor here. So the 7 good qualities of a Buddhist practitioner and the 4 kinds of sustenance here are the 4 stages of concentration, the 4 stages of jhana practice. And the Buddha says when we have these qualities, then we cannot be overrun by Mara. So we can't be taken over by the forces of temptation and delusion, which in the suttas are commonly represented by the character Mara, who's a powerful deva who occasionally would come and try to hassle the Buddha or try to tempt Buddhist practitioners to do unwholesome things or unwise things. So the Buddha is saying when we've cultivated these 7 good qualities and have experience with the 4 stages of jhana, then we will not fall prey to the temptations and delusions of Mara. So the first one, he says, just as a royal frontier citadel has pillars with deep foundations, firmly embedded, imperturbable, and unshakable to defend those within and repel those outside, in the same way, a noble disciple has faith in the Buddha's awakening. And it gives the standard formula which we use to recall the qualities of the Buddha. So, itipiso bhagava arahang sammasambuddho, etc. So it says, the Blessed One is perfected, a fully awakened Buddha, accomplished in knowledge and conduct, holy, knower of the world, supreme trainer of those who wish to be trained, teacher of gods and humans, awakened and blessed. And he says, a disciple of the noble ones with faith as their pillar gives up the unskillful and develops the skillful, or gives up the unwholesome and develops the wholesome. Gives up the blameworthy and develops the blameless, and keeps themselves pure. So this is the first quality. So just as one needs to have strong foundations and pillars in order to have a strong citadel, in the same way, if one wants one's Buddhist practice to be strong, then one needs to have faith in the Buddha. So faith in the qualities of the Buddha, faith that the Buddha actually was fully enlightened, and that he taught the path to full enlightenment, and that following this path does lead one to perfect purity of mind, perfect purity of heart. So with that kind of strong, unshakable faith in the Buddha, then one's Buddhist practice will then be much more stable and reliable. Then the second one, he says, just as a citadel has a moat that is deep and wide, in the same way, a disciple of the noble ones has a conscience. They have a conscience about bad conduct by body, speech, and mind, and about any harmful, unwholesome qualities. So the second one, so again, what's the purpose of a moat? A moat is to keep your enemies far away from the castle. So in the same way, we have a sense of conscience. Conscience is our ability to know right from wrong, our ability to understand good and evil. And so when we have a clear understanding of right and wrong, good and evil, then naturally we will stay far away from doing evil things. Naturally, we will avoid doing harmful things. So just as the moat keeps your enemies at a distance, in the same way, conscience keeps wrongdoing at a distance. And the Pali word here is hiri. So this quality and the next one that's being listed are hiri and ottappa, which both together are what we mean by conscience in the English language. So this ability to recognize right and wrong, good and evil, and the natural tendency to avoid doing evil, the natural tendency to avoid causing harm deliberately. So first one is hiri, which is translated here as conscience, and the second one is ottappa, which is translated here as prudence. Prudence is a slightly odd term. I might use consideration, so being considerate. But we'll go with prudence since that's what the translator here had written. So it says, just as a citadel has a patrol path that is high and wide, in the same way a disciple of the noble ones is prudent. So again, the purpose of the patrol path is to clearly see the enemies from a distance. So before the enemies get close to the citadel, one can see them from a distance. So in the same way, with the cultivation of one's conscience, one's sense of consideration and prudence, then one can see the impulse to do something harmful. So the impulse to do something inappropriate or offensive or evil, one can see that impulse from a long way off. One can see it starting to arise in the mind before it gets out of control. So seeing it arising, then one can cut it off. One can stop oneself from doing something harmful. Then the fourth one, he says, just as a citadel has stores of many weapons, both projectile and handheld, in the same way, a noble disciple is very learned. They remember and keep what they've learned, those teachings which are good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end, meaningful and well phrased, describing a spiritual teaching that's entirely full and pure. They are very learned in such teachings, remembering them, reciting them, mentally scrutinizing them, and comprehending them thoroughly. So this one I find actually really cute. The soldiers who are defending a citadel need to have lots of weapons in order to fend off the attackers, a lot of different tools at their disposal. So in the same way, if we want to deal with the various unwholesome tendencies of mind, if we want to be able to face any of the challenges that we encounter in our spiritual practice, then we need to have a lot of understanding, a lot of knowledge. We need to know what the Buddha taught. Because the Buddha taught a lot of really useful, practical information for how to train the mind, for how to deal with a wide range of different hindrances and obstacles in the spiritual path. So reading and studying the suttas then is like the citadel stockpiling weapons. So developing experience with a wide variety of ways of training the mind. Again, it's like building up your set of tools. Building up your supplies so that you can face any kind of challenge that comes your way. Then the fifth one, so just as many kind of armed forces reside in a citadel, so many different kinds of soldiers. It says, in the same way, a noble disciple is energetic. The Pali word here is virya, which, as I've explained in the past, literally means heroism, the quality of being a hero. So I think that's part of the metaphor the Buddha is drawing here is so you have all these soldiers in the citadel. So in theory, soldiers are heroes, heroic people, full of courage and dedication. So in the same way, one should have virya, this quality of heroism, this quality of courage and dedication. So he says, one lives with energy aroused for giving up unwholesome qualities and developing wholesome qualities. They are strong, staunchly vigorous, not slacking off when it comes to developing wholesome qualities. So again, these are the qualities of a hero, someone who knows what needs to be done and courageously puts forth effort to do what needs to be done. So we commit ourselves to trying to remove our unwholesome habits of mind and to instead cultivate wholesome habits of mind. Then the sixth one, it says, just as a citadel has a gatekeeper who is wise, competent, and intelligent, who keeps strangers out and lets known people in the same way a disciple of the noble ones is mindful. They have utmost mindfulness and alertness and can remember and recall what was said and done long ago. So the gatekeeper is the one who checks people when they're approaching to see, are these people safe to let in or not? So in the same way, mindfulness is the constant, careful awareness of everything we're doing with body, speech, and mind. Constant, careful awareness of what's going on in our mind. What are the impulses that are arising? What are the thoughts that are arising? What are the behaviors that we're engaging in? So looking to see what is wholesome, what is good, what is right. And that we permit, that we encourage. And on the other hand, what do we see in our mind that's maybe harmful or not so good? Well, that we keep out. So the previous quality of energy, so this or heroic effort, it's about eliminating unwholesome tendencies while cultivating wholesome tendencies. But how do you recognize what's going on? Well, you need to have mindfulness as a basis. So this mindfulness, which has the competence and intelligence to know what mental tendencies are harmful, well, those we need to keep out, and what are beneficial, well, those we need to protect and cultivate. So that's the sixth one, so mindfulness as one's gatekeeper. And the seventh one, the Buddha says, just as a citadel has a wall that's high and wide, covered with plaster, to defend those within and repel those outside, in the same way, a disciple of the noble ones has wisdom. They have the wisdom which knows arising and passing away, wisdom which is noble, penetrative, and leads to the complete ending of suffering. So here he's talking about specifically the wisdom which knows impermanence. So one of the ongoing themes in the suttas is the Buddha placed tremendous importance on developing the recognition of impermanence, recognizing that absolutely everything has the nature of arising and disappearing, of coming into being and then immediately ceasing to be, the nature of constant change. And awareness of the constantly changing nature of all things, the Buddha says, is the direct precondition for awakening. So when we see that everything is impermanent and insubstantial, then the mind naturally lets go. And when the mind lets go completely, then one realizes the true nature of reality. One is able to attain full awakening in that moment. And then the Buddha says, what are the four the four stages of jhana, the four stages of concentration? So, and again, he's analogizing these to the four kinds of sustenance, the four kinds of food and medicine that the people living in the citadel need. So the first one, he says, just as the royal frontier citadel has much hay, wood, and water, in the same way, a disciple of the noble ones, secluded from sensuality and from unwholesome states of mind, enters and remains in the first jhana, which has the euphoria and happiness born of seclusion, accompanied by thought and exploration. So this is the first one. So this is the most coarse and simple form of concentration. So when we're talking about the jhanas, and of course the jhanas cannot be called coarse and simple by any means. They're actually quite challenging states of mind to access, especially if one is not living in a carefully controlled meditative environment, or one is not living in seclusion. If one is mixed up in a lot of daily agitating activities, it's very difficult to get even to the first stage of jhana. But the first one is characterized by a sense of euphoria. So an overwhelming sense of pleasure and joy saturating body and mind. So then the Buddha analogizes it to hay, wood, and water. So the basic necessities for a human settlement to survive, the basic needs. So this is the basic initiation into deep concentration. So this first stage where the mind is very settled and very joyful. It's not yet completely stable, not yet completely stabilized, but it's extremely focused, extremely steady, and extremely joyful. The second one, he says, just as the frontier citadel has much rice and barley stored up. So here we're talking about food. Again, critically necessary for survival. And this one is the second stage of jhana, which he says has the euphoria and bliss born of concentration, with internal clarity and mental unification, without thought or mental exploration. So the second stage of jhana is much more peaceful and steady because all background thoughts have disappeared from the mind. So the mind is fully stabilized into this euphoric state of concentration. And so this he analogizes then to one's basic food. So rice and grain, the basic foundation of the diet in an agricultural society. Then the third one, he says, just as a king's a royal frontier citadel has much food such as sesame, green lentils, and black lentils stored up. So this is more refined food, which one uses to supplement one's diet. So in the same way, he's talking about an even more refined state of concentration, the third jhana. So it says, with the fading away of euphoria, a disciple of the noble ones enters and remains in the third jhana, where they meditate with equanimity, mindful and aware, personally experiencing the happiness of which the noble ones declare. Equanimous and mindful, one meditates in bliss. So in the third state of deep concentration, the euphoria fades. So the mind's becoming even more peaceful and still. So there's still a pervasive sense of happiness, of bliss, but that bright electric euphoria of the first two jhana stages has faded away. And the mind is settling into an even deeper state of stillness and peace. Then the fourth one, he says, just as the royal frontier citadel has much medicine, such as ghee, butter, oil, honey, molasses, and salt. In the same way, and here he's describing the fourth jhana, he says, in the same way, giving up pleasure and pain, and with the former disappearance of elation and depression, a disciple of the noble ones enters and remains in the fourth jhana, which is free of pleasure and pain, and has pure equanimity and mindfulness. So this is the most refined state of meditative concentration in the standard list of the four jhanas, which is characterized by purity of equanimity and mindfulness. So the mind is completely alert and aware, yet entirely non-reactive. So the deepest possible state of serenity and peace, which is accessible to an unawakened mind, in which the Buddha says forms the ideal conditions for cultivating true wisdom, starting from that place of completely stable, non-reactive awareness of the fourth jhana, the fourth stage of concentration. And then the Buddha reiterates, when a noble disciple has these 7 good qualities and gets the 4 stages of jhana, these blissful meditations in the present life that belong to the higher mind, when they want, without trouble or difficulty, says, then they are called a disciple of the noble ones who cannot be overrun by Mara, by the wicked one. So that's the end of the discourse. So at this time, we can respect the sutta with 3 sadhus, and then I'll see if there's any questions. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And hello to all the people joining in online. Hello to Suzanne, Rick, Bhumika, Yankee, Karuna, Jayanta, Manal, Kim, and Gregory. Good to see you all joining in. I don't see any questions online. Are there any questions about this discourse? Yes, go ahead.
You mentioned at one point that Mara was like a
Mm-hmm.
The second point you mentioned Mara was a thing. I'm just confused on
Yeah.
what Mara is.
Mara is a deva, and he's also a really evil person. These are not mutually exclusive. So it requires a lot of good karma to be born as a deva, but that doesn't mean that all devas are good. Just as someone might have made a lot of good karma in past lives and have really lucky, fortunate conditions in this life, but they choose to be really nasty and selfish. It's the same with devas. So the Mara devas are members of the Paranimita Vasavati Loka, so the highest of the sensual domain deva realms. So yeah, it requires a lot of good karma to be born in such a lofty heaven realm. But they're also really nasty, vicious, evil beings. And the Mara that we normally encounter in the suttas in particular has made it his personal mission to try to stop people from practicing Buddhism. So very unpleasant character. But there's a number of other examples in the suttas where devas are mentioned which are not particularly nice, not particularly respectful, not particularly kind. So there's no guarantee, just because you're born in a heaven realm, there's no guarantee you're going to be a good person. It's like someone who's born into a wealthy, noble family among humans. Doesn't guarantee they're going to be nice. Okay?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Yes.
I would like to ask if you maybe could talk more, because the analogy with military seems to me very divisive, or military is connected with killing, and maybe it's justified by that we are killing the bad thing, the bad person. But also growing up in the communist regime, maybe the communist is good, the anti-communist is bad. But in my eyes, the bad is the good, because we are anti-regime. So that's where I'm losing myself in the question of good and bad, and
Mhm.
how can I justify these methods as something which leads to something harmless. This kind of thing.
Yeah. So, well, first off, I think that the metaphor that he's using, so using military ideas as metaphors, he was doing that as a way of helping people understand. Because he might have been giving this teaching to people who used to be in the military or people who were involved with the military in some way. So he was speaking in a way that they could understand. He also often used metaphors related to farming, because again, a lot of people would understand how farming works. So using farming metaphors was a way of teaching people. So I think similarly, he used military metaphors because that was a way that some people could understand. As for the concept of killing, so again, in Buddhism, killing is always considered wrong. Deliberately hurting another person is always wrong. It's never right. It's always wrong. So as for the thing you gave about being pro-communist or anti-communist, well, that's actually completely beside the point. The question is, are you trying to help people or not? So someone might be pro-communist because they really believe that that's the best way to help people. In which case, okay, fine. Somebody else might really believe that a different kind of economic system is better for helping people. So they might be anti-communist because they think a different system will be more helpful for people. That's also fine. So personally, I'm not either pro or anti-communist. I'm pro-kindness. And if kindness takes the form of communism, well, okay. If it takes the form of something other than communism, well, that's also okay. As long as we're practicing kindness and compassion and generosity, really trying to help each other, that's what we mean by good in Buddhism. So whether that takes the form of communism or it takes the form of a republic, or it takes the form of a monarchy, or it takes the form of whatever, doesn't matter. Like the actual form of government is not important. What matters is, are we committed to kindness? Are we committed to mutual support? Are we actually really caring about each other as fellow people? Yeah, and if we're using our ideals as excuses to hurt other people, then from a Buddhist standpoint, that's wrong. That's bad. That's evil. That's not to be done. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it's a nice view. I will think about it.
Okay. And we have a question here from Ajahn Nisibo. Hello, Ajahn Nisibo. Good to see you joining in. Good friend from Seattle. And he says, how do you work with Mara day to day?
I didn't know you were personal communication with him, Bhante.
I hope I'm not. As in, I hope I'm not in personal communication with Mara. So here, I assume then you mean Mara in the general sense of temptation. Actually, the main way I work with it is constantly returning to contentment in the present moment, contentment with things exactly as they are right now. That's incredibly effective for cutting off any kind of temptation, because temptations are always about the future. So contentment with things just as they are cuts right through that temptation. And the other main thing is mindfulness of the body. So for most of my monastic life, this has been the real core, the foundation, the heart of my practice is body mindfulness. And it's really incredible how well that resolves almost any problem that comes up. And Rick says, can you talk about using the simile of being like a warrior in a citadel while observing the precepts and not falling into aversion? Yes. So what you are trying to do is to overcome your own unwholesome tendencies of mind. So those are the enemies. The enemies are your own tendencies towards greed and hatred, your own tendency towards spaciness and confusion. That's the enemy. And so we fight that by cultivating mindfulness, by cultivating concentration, by cultivating gentleness, by cultivating generosity. So whereas a warrior might use swords and guns and other such nasty things, instead our weapons are kindness, generosity, mindfulness, patience, tolerance, friendliness. That's what we use. And our enemies are not other people. Our enemies are our own harsh tendencies, our own unwholesome tendencies. That's what we're trying to overcome. So it's about transforming the mind. I actually find that the image of gardening really useful here. So you have a garden, and the garden is full of vegetables and flowers and weeds. So what do? You go out and you remove the weeds while taking care of the flowers and the vegetables. So it's actually similar. You might say, oh, well, that's violent. And it's like, yeah, that's true. But we're trying to pull out the weeds so that we have a healthy garden, which is producing good things, useful things. So in the same way, we would look at our mind and we look, what are the weeds growing in the mind? And how can we pluck out those weeds from the mind? And how can we work on cultivating flowers and vegetables in the mind? So things that are beautiful and useful. How can we preserve and cultivate those instead of the weeds? And that's the last question. So if there's nothing else, okay, so we can go ahead and conclude at this time with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you all next time.